Welcome to Life Stories, where we share inspiring tales of courage, resilience, and transformation. Today, we bring you the compelling journey of Sarah, a pastor's daughter whose life takes an unexpected turn when she discovers a shocking truth about her father. As she struggles with betrayal and faith, Sarah embarks on a path of self-discovery and healing, finding hope and purpose in the face of adversity. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories and hit the notification bell to join us for this unforgettable story. Let's begin today's journey together and uncover the lessons within Sarah's remarkable tale. I remember the sound of my mother's voice echoing through the house that morning. "Sarah, are you still in there?" she called from the kitchen. The smell of breakfast drifted up the stairs, a comforting mix of coffee and toast. I was sitting cross-legged on my bed, humming softly as I braided my hair, a melody from choir practice floating through my mind. It was a small, repetitive tune, nothing extraordinary, but it brought a sense of peace to the little space I called my own. The room was modest, the kind of place where I could escape. My Bible sat open on the desk beside a half-filled notebook where I often scribbled down prayers, thoughts, and the occasional lyric. This was my haven, the one place where I could think and pray without the weight of everyone's expectations pressing down on me. Being the daughter of Pastor Michael, one of the most renowned church leaders in the state, wasn't easy. It was like living under a microscope. Every move I made scrutinized by a congregation that seemed to watch my every step. "The pastor's daughter must be perfect," they'd whisper. I heard them. Even when they thought I wasn't listening, they commented on everything: how I dressed, how I spoke, even how I sang in the choir. It was exhausting, trying to live up to the impossible standards that seemed to cling to me like a second skin. "Coming, Mama," I called back, quickly tying my braid into a loose bun. As I hurried to the dining table, I passed the framed photographs lining the hallway. Most of them were of my father, Pastor Michael, standing proudly in front of the church or shaking hands with important-looking people. They told the story of a man who had built something incredible from humble beginnings. The church had started small, a handful of devoted members gathering in our backyard for weekly services. But as word spread, the congregation grew. And soon enough, my father's sermons were drawing people from neighboring towns. The backyard gave way to a modest church building. And then, over the years, that building transformed into a sprawling megachurch that could seat thousands. When I reached the table, my father was already there, sitting at the head as always. He was flipping through a stack of papers, his glasses perched low on his nose. His forehead was creased with concentration, and he barely glanced up as I sat down. "Good morning, Papa," I said quietly. "Morning," he muttered, not looking up. His voice was distant, a far cry from the warmth I remembered from my childhood. My father had been like this a lot lately, preoccupied, busy, and strangely detached. There was a time when he would ask about my day, when he would laugh and share stories from his own childhood. But those moments had become fewer and further between as the church grew. It was as if the man I'd once known had been swallowed up by the persona of Pastor Michael, the figure everyone looked to for guidance and inspiration. After breakfast, I found myself standing in the middle of the church hall, arranging songbooks for choir practice. The vast room, usually filled with the sound of worship and the energy of hundreds of voices, was silent. I liked it this way: calm, quiet, peaceful. The altar stood at the far end, the place where my father delivered his sermons every Sunday. It looked the same as always, but something about it felt different now. When I was younger, my father's messages had been about love and forgiveness, about living a life that honored God. But lately, his sermons had taken on a different tone. "God wants to make you rich," he would proclaim, his voice booming across the congregation. "Sow a seed today and watch your life change forever." The words echoed in my mind, leaving a bitter taste. It wasn't that I didn't believe in giving to God or trusting Him for blessings, but it felt like the focus had shifted away from faith, away from holiness, and toward something that felt unsettlingly transactional. It wasn't just the sermons, either. The church itself was changing. More people were coming, but they weren't the familiar faces I'd grown up with. There were men in expensive suits, women draped in designer dresses, even politicians sitting in the front rows. During choir practice, I turned to my best friend, Anna, adjusting my microphone as I spoke. "Do you notice how different it feels these days?" "What do you mean?" Anna asked, her tone casual as she flipped through her sheet music. "The church," I said softly. It's not about God anymore." Anna shrugged. "As long as miracles are happening, who cares?" Her words lingered, unsettling me further. People were flocking to the church, claiming their lives had been transformed. They shared testimonies of financial breakthroughs, healed bodies, and answered prayers. And yet, for all the clapping and shouting of hallelujahs, something about it felt hollow. Later that night, as I sat on my bed, the questions swirled in my mind. I wanted to believe in the good, the lives changed, the hope restored. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Something essential. Little did I know, the peace I clung to in my small room was about to be shattered. The truths I was about to uncover would force me to question everything: my faith, my family, and the man I had always called my father. The night of the revival came swiftly. The church was abuzz with excitement, and I could feel the energy even before I stepped into the grand hall. It was packed to the brim, every pew filled, with people even standing at the back. The atmosphere was electric, alive with the anticipation of miracles and breakthroughs. For many, these revival nights were moments to remember, a time for hope, renewal, and the promise of transformation. I loved singing during these services. The choir was like a second family to me, and there was something about the collective voices rising together in worship that felt transcendent. That night, as I stood with the choir, my heart swelled with a mix of nerves and excitement. The music filled the air, and for a brief moment, I felt the purity of the worship I had always cherished. But when my father stepped onto the pulpit, something shifted. His energy was palpable, his voice commanding as he launched into a sermon unlike any I had heard before. "Tonight is your night," he declared, his voice ringing out across the hall. "God has ordained this moment for your breakthrough. If you want to see your life change, sow a dangerous seed tonight." The congregation erupted, people rushing forward to the altar with money, checks, and even car keys. The fervor was almost overwhelming, a tidal wave of emotion and desperation. I should have felt inspired, uplifted even. But instead, unease crept into my heart. My father's words, once focused on God's love and grace, now felt more like a transaction, a promise of blessings in exchange for wealth. When the service finally ended around 2 a.m., I stayed back to help pack up. The hall, now quiet and nearly empty, felt different in the stillness. I moved around the stage, gathering microphones and songbooks, when I noticed something strange. My father was still there, speaking in hushed tones with a small group of men near the pulpit. They were gathered close, their expressions serious. And before I could think better of it, I found myself drawn to them. I followed at a distance as they moved toward the private room behind the altar, a place I had never been allowed to enter. My mother had always said it was where my father went to pray and seek God's guidance. But tonight, it felt different. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and my heart raced as I approached the door. I paused, unsure of what I was doing. But curiosity got the better of me. Pressing myself against the wall, I peered through the small crack in the door. What I saw inside froze me in place. The room was dimly lit, candles casting flickering shadows on the walls. Symbols I didn't recognize were drawn on the floor, and in the center stood my father, holding a bowl filled with a dark, viscous liquid. One by one, he marked the foreheads of the men around him, murmuring words I couldn't understand. Their voices rose in rhythmic chants, deep and unsettling, unlike any prayer I had ever heard. "By this blood, you will prosper," my father said, his voice steady and commanding. "By this blood, we will prosper," they repeated, bowing their heads. My chest tightened. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't the father I knew. This wasn't the man who had taught me to love God, to live with integrity, to find joy in faith. This was someone else entirely, a stranger leading something dark and unfathomable. I wanted to run, to scream, but my body wouldn't move. I stood there, paralyzed. As the chants continued, their voices weaving a spell of dread around me, one of the men turned slightly, his gaze almost brushing the doorway, and I stumbled back, my hand gripping the wall to steady myself. As quietly as I could, I slipped away, my legs trembling beneath me. By the time I reached the empty hall, my heart was pounding so loudly I thought it might burst. I sank into a pew, tears streaming down my face as the weight of what I had seen crashed over me. What was I supposed to do? How could I reconcile the man in that room with the father I had loved and admired my whole life? The congregation trusted him, believed in him. They gave their money, their faith, their hope, all to a man who stood at the center of something so profoundly wrong. I stayed there for what felt like hours, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. If I confronted him, what would happen? If I stayed silent, how could I live with myself? And if the truth came out, what would it mean for my family, for the thousands of people who looked to my father for guidance? By the time dawn broke, I knew one thing for certain: I couldn't stay. Whatever my father was involved in, it was bigger than me, and it was something I couldn't face alone. With trembling hands, I packed a small bag, leaving behind the life I had known. As I slipped out into the quiet streets, I whispered a prayer, my voice breaking under the weight of my fear. "God, guide me. I don't know where I'm going, but I need you now more than ever." The sun was just beginning to rise as I walked away from the house that had been my home for as long as I could remember. The streets were eerily quiet, the early morning silence broken only by the occasional bark of a stray dog or the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. My bag felt heavy in my hand, though it held only the bare essentials: a few clothes, my Bible, and the small amount of money I had managed to save. Every step away from my family felt like a betrayal, but staying felt impossible. The image of my father in that darkened room, leading a ritual so far removed from the faith he had always preached, was burned into my mind. I couldn't reconcile the man I had grown up admiring with the figure I had seen that night. My heart ached with confusion and grief, but fear drove me forward. By mid-morning, I found myself in a bus terminal, the hum of distant engines and murmured conversations a strange comfort. I didn't know where I was going, I only knew I couldn't stay anywhere familiar. I purchased a ticket to a small town I had never heard of before, somewhere far enough to disappear but close enough to feel I could return if I needed to. The bus ride was long and uneventful, giving me plenty of time to think. Questions swirled in my mind. What would my mother think when she found my note? Would my father come looking for me? Would anyone believe me if I ever told them what I had seen? The weight of it all pressed down on me, and I rested my forehead against the cool glass of the window, watching the scenery blur past. By the time I arrived at my destination, the sun had dipped low in the sky. The town was quiet and unassuming, a far cry from the bustling streets of my hometown. I found a small room to rent with the money I had brought and settled in. The unfamiliarity of my surroundings both daunting and strangely liberating. The first few days were a haze of exhaustion and uncertainty. I avoided the church in the center of town, unable to bear the thought of stepping into a sanctuary so soon after what I had witnessed. Instead, I spent my time walking the quiet streets, trying to piece together a new life in a place where no one knew me. But the memories followed me, unrelenting and vivid. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my father's face, heard the rhythmic chanting, and felt the suffocating weight of that room. The betrayal cut deep. Not just because of what he had done, but because of what it meant for the faith he had taught me to hold dear. One night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I whispered a prayer into the darkness. God, if you're still here, please show me. If everything I've believed isn't a lie, help me find my way back to you. It was the first time I had prayed since leaving home, and though my words were halting and uncertain, they felt like the start of something. The next morning, I opened my Bible, hesitant but determined. The pages felt strange under my fingers, as though I were touching them for the first time. My eyes landed on a passage in 2 Timothy, for the time will come when people will not put up with sound doctrine. Instead, to suit their own desires, they will gather around them a great number of teachers to say what their itching ears want to hear. The words hit me like a thunderclap. They described everything I had been wrestling with. The sermons focused on wealth, the promises of prosperity, the spectacle of it all. For the first time, I began to understand that my father's actions didn't define my faith. God hadn't changed. It was people who had twisted his message for their own gain. As I read further, I stumbled upon warnings of false prophets, of those who would perform great signs to deceive even the faithful. The realization sank deep. My father had strayed. But that didn't mean God had abandoned me. The faith I had grown up with was still real, still true, even if the man who had taught it to me had lost his way. That evening, I ventured into the small church I had passed by so many times. It was humble. Nothing like the grandeur of my father's megachurch. But the warmth inside was undeniable. The worship was simple. The message honest. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of peace. I stayed in the back, blending into the quiet crowd. As the service ended and the congregation filed out, I lingered for a moment, taking in the atmosphere. It wasn't perfect, but it felt real. And for the first time, I allowed myself to hope that maybe, just maybe, I could begin to heal. In the quiet of a humble church, Sarah found what she had thought was lost forever: her faith, her peace, and her purpose. The betrayal she had faced had shaken her deeply, but it also led her to rediscover a God who had never abandoned her. Through courage and resilience, she exposed the truth, freeing others from deception and allowing herself to heal. Sarah's journey wasn't just about leaving the shadows of her father's actions, it was about stepping into her own light. A testament to the enduring power of faith and integrity. Her story reminds us that no matter how dark the path, hope can always be found. If you were inspired by Sarah's journey, don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories for more heartfelt tales. Click the notification bell to stay updated and join us next time for another unforgettable story. Thank you for watching.